Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you joined us today. Good morning, Nellie, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to have you on the show today and to learn all about you and your business and what you're doing to improve work environments for people. But before we get to that, I would like to start by hearing about the first job you ever had as a young person.
Ooh. So I started working very early. I was only 12 years old, so just semi-legal. But my first job was actually helping stroke patients with
Mm.
physical exercise. So it was in my very small hometown back in Sweden, and I've always had this desire since I was very young that I wanted to start working very early. I wanted to get out in the working world, start getting experience, start like getting ahead and get out there. So I did start when I was 12, and this role was going to patients that had a stroke,
Mhm.
and helping them with their physical exercise, usually on a bike, or like making sure they didn't fall off the equipment. Sometimes help them to change a light bulb or do some grocery shopping. So that was my very first job. And then the first like more like proper job, if you will, was McDonald's. So I started at McDonald's when I was 15, like 14 and a half, cleaning toilets initially because you're only allowed to manage money when you're 15 years old. So I spent like half a year just cleaning the toilets and then becoming a cashier when I was 15. So I would say that that was more a proper employment, which was my first job.
Well, my goodness, starting at 12 and then McDonald's at 14 and a half. Where did that desire, that drive, that work ethic come from?
I think I was very driven to learn most of all. And I was very, very driven to get out of my hometown. That was like my number one motivator. I was like, I cannot live here and I cannot have a career here. I was very clear early on that I wanted to do big things. I wanted to have big impact. I wanted to live and work around the world. So same when I started studying English, right? I was like around like, yeah, 12, 13 when you start properly with English. And I was like, this is too slow. And I knew that if I wanted to work outside of Sweden, like no one speaks Swedish outside of Sweden, right? So you need to pick up another language. So I started like I thought school was too slow in the pace of learning English. So I started reading The Economist, Wall Street Journal, lots of international media. Didn't understand anything of the content, obviously. Like The Economist is not written for 13-year-olds. But I did pick up a lot of the English vocabulary and the words and so on. So I've always been driven at that point. It was primarily around how do I get out of this? How do I get to an international big city where I can speak English and have a career and challenge myself and put myself out there? And I knew that the earlier I started both working and speaking English, the sooner that would happen. So that was the driver behind it.
Wow, that is amazing. These really grown ideas as a young person. When you think about those first jobs, have any experiences or lessons sort of formed you in the rest of the work that you've done, or were they more just kind of one-offs?
No, a lot, especially McDonald's. I think I was a different person before McDonald's and after McDonald's. That
Mm,
is still the one job that has changed me the most, or rather, I would say, like, allowed me to find myself.
mm.
Because when I started when I was 14, I was quite annoyed by like high school girls and how much focus was on like the right nail polish and makeup and clothes, and I just found it quite boring, frankly.
Mhm.
I like the party aspect of high school and I've always liked that aspect, but the whole like vanity and those discussions, I was like, this is not for me. So I felt a little bit out of place. And then when I started McDonald's, one, I was pretty much the youngest. I mean, everyone else was a college grad and like not grad, but like we're being in college and doing it as an extra job outside of college at the time
Mhm.
to make some extra money. So everyone was like 5 to 10 years older than I was. There were some in like what we call upper secondary school, high school, but that was still like 2, 3, 4 years older than I was. So I started getting friends that were older than me and had different perspectives and different priorities than nail polish. So that really engaged me. And I was like, this is great. These are great topics of conversation. And then I think most of all, McDonald's taught me, or it allowed me to explore and experience what I really, really enjoy. And I learned at McDonald's that I love the fast pace. I love
Mhm.
this fast pace of things happening all the time in all different corners, and just like it gives me a lot of energy. I love the people aspect. And I love the commercial aspect, the fact that you can see on a screen how much revenue is going up by the number of cheeseburgers you sell. And I love that whole like competitive element of it and the numbers, the commercial aspect, and then the leadership aspect as well. I discovered that I love leading teams and I love helping people succeed and making sure that they are really, really successful and happy and in what they do. So I think that's why McDonald's really changed me, because it allowed me to discover those three areas: the fast pace, the commercial, and the leadership, that then took me to all my other jobs, I would say. Because then I started in recruitment, was my first job out of college. And recruitment is also very fast paced, it's commercial and it's leadership. And it was also what kind of allowed me to discover that I really want to run my own business and be an entrepreneur, because that's also fast paced and commercial and leadership. So those three themes have been with me since that very first day at McDonald's. And that's why I'm very, very grateful for it, and allowed me to just be myself and have fun and interact with these older people that I resonated more with than my high school friends at the time.
What a brilliant analysis of working at McDonald's. And I think it goes so much to the stories that we tell ourselves. Sometimes we find ourselves in what we might call a dead-end job or a throwaway job, or this is just a placeholder. And when we tell ourselves that story, we're miserable. And yet you could have, two people working in McDonald's and one feels that way, and the other one experiences what you experience, this in a way, finding yourself and finding your people and seeing what resonates with you and 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 seeing that that is what's possible. I absolutely love that because it isn't ever really the job. It's who we are and what we decide to make out of it and what we decide to see. And that no matter where we are, whether at McDonald's, where we are, or the CEO of a company, it's who are we when we show up to work? And what have we decided to see and grow? And how are we going to participate in our own career, no matter where we happen to be?
Yeah, so right. And it's so true that there's no such thing as a good job, right? Like there's only the right job for the right person and the wrong job for the wrong person. And I think exactly to your point about McDonald's, right? So many people and so many of my colleagues when I was there as well saw it as a like dead end job. Like, why am I here flipping burgers? And like, but it's if you reflect on like what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy rather than what
Mhm,
the actual job is,
mhm.
then I think that teaches you a lot more, because you can also in the same way discover like, oh, I don't like this, for example, but then it's usually not about I don't like flipping burgers, but it might be I don't enjoy interacting with customers who are going to scold me for having a pickle in the cheeseburger when every cheeseburger in the world has a pickle in them. But then it might be like, I don't enjoy customer interactions. That might be a learning that someone takes away from McDonald's, right? But I think it's
Yes.
important to think about what are the parts of the job, and every job will have parts that you don't enjoy, but
Mhm.
what is that makes you feel alive? What is it that makes you feel like this is energizing me, this is something I enjoy doing, that is fun? And for me it wasn't like, oh, I enjoy cleaning toilets and flipping burgers. Like I didn't take it at face value, right? I was looking at the
Right.
underlying threads of it, and that's how these the pace, the commercial, and the leadership, those are the three that came out. And then from that time I was like, how can I find other jobs that have these three components of them? Because I know that these three components in combination is where I thrive and what I really enjoy. So I think it's more seeing the threads rather than taking it at face value.
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes we can be a little bit too literal in, or why would I enjoy taking out the trash? Well, okay, well, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about the aesthetics? Are we talking about um, you know, being customer facing versus not being customer facing? And so why am I enjoying something, or why does something not resonate with me? And of course, we learn so much by what isn't for us, right? And so when we
Yeah,
think about in the next job, of course, no matter what kind of job you have, there are going to be aspects that you find less, that you just don't really like, but it's just a part of being an adult, being a professional, these things have to get done. But how do we have the majority of our time doing those sorts of things that we really find that we're able to contribute at a high level because it resonates with us?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So so your first post a college job, you were into recruiting, and then where did you go from there?
So from recruitment, I actually started Tigerhall.
You
So
did.
I had had a couple of businesses earlier. I started my first business when I was in high school as well through a program called Junior Achievement, where you can start a business when you're under 18. And that was to teach senior citizens digital literacy. So helping them understand social media and internet and computers. And then I had a couple of like social media consulting firms, both in Sweden and when I did university in Singapore. And then I had another like startup. So I had dabbled a bit in entrepreneurship and starting my own. And it was actually inspired by my experience in recruitment. So when I saw a lot of my clients were trying to go through change and keep their teams up with it and develop the right knowledge, the mindsets, the capabilities, and having people be on board with what they needed to do for the business. And they didn't really have good tools to do that. It was a lot of emails and SharePoint and terrible, boring LMS platforms and intranets that nobody visited and so on. So that's when I started rethinking about how can we do this better, and seeing what people are engaged with outside of work. Like people
Mm.
spend their time on their TikToks, Instagram, Spotify, Netflix, and that's where people enjoy spending time, right? So how can we build more of that into corporate environments as well, both when it comes to communications, capability building, change management, and engaging people in a different way. So I got that experience when I was in recruitment, and from there I decided to go out and start building Tigerhall. So that was actually my after 4.5 years in recruitment, I resigned to start building Tigerhall.
I was looking at your website, and one thing that you have at the beginning is Tigerhall driving or drive change through your organization, not against it, or drive change with your organization, not against it. And
Mm,
I absolutely love that because so much of the name of the game today in this very changing world is change management, right? We have new technologies. The world of work is just in this big area of change. And so it seems that a lot of resistance is because it's it's working against the people in the organization, or it's being forced upon them, and they're being asked to comply in this particular sort of inorganic way where they're not being listened to or heard, or in all the different kinds of ways in which you said the communication happens. So, how did you arrive at that idea of really working with the organization instead of against it?
I think that's the most important thing. And it's very, very hard to accomplish anything if your people are not on board.
Mhm.
And a big part of this came from seeing it firsthand. I was a middle manager. I was a middle manager in a large global organization headquartered in London. And I was in Singapore with a regional team. And just seeing the disconnect, right? Like between the at the top and on the ground.
Mm.
And I think that's something that has been further and further apart from each other in the last, say, 10, 20 years,
Mhm.
where now employers and employees are so far from each other. And it's almost this divergence that has been driven more and more. And of course, with things like the like tech boom and bust and the layoffs and things like AI coming into the workplace, there's a lot of fear, right? And people are not really working together anymore to solve
Mhm.
many of these challenges, and that's something that I care deeply about, is how do we unite together to drive change and not see this as like, well, they are my employees so everyone has to do it, which is the approach that many leaders still have today. And they're driving change in then a very top down way, and it's do as I say or else kind of approach, and just speaking at people. And I think it's not a good approach to do that, both because it's just like it's the wrong way in my opinion to handle it and to treat other human beings like that. But most of all, it's also not just smart. It's not smart. It's not
Right.
smart business, because actually so many of those people who are on the ground have a lot more intel and insight and information about how can you best execute that change than what you do in a central headquarters. So it's
Yeah.
actually much smarter to listen to them and
Right.
having these two-way feedback loops where you can understand like how are they impacted by the change, how is this affecting on the ground. Like take a grocery as an example, right? Like a grocery chain, it's impossible for someone sitting in corporate HQ to know the ins and outs of like how customers are greeted in that store and the how the cashiers can do this and that different, or how they sort like food waste and things like that. It's very hard to know these micro challenges on the ground.
Mhm.
So you're going to get a lot further a lot faster if you actually listen and see what's happening on the ground. So getting that intel is so critical, and that's why I say with the organization, because
Yeah.
it drives several purposes, right? Both that you get the intel and insights and information, but also that people feel more empowered and engaged because they are,
Right.
when they can shape it. And I'm a big believer in the like not the consumer model but the citizen model,
Hmm.
and like how do we move people from being just passive consumers who think that we're going to get served all the time and things are just going to be delivered to us as easy as possible, to how can we make them proactive citizens instead and
Hmm.
make them feel like they are part of the change and they can drive this and they have the power to influence. Because once people feel like they have the power to influence and they can actually shape this change and the outcome of it, that's where you see engagement goes up massively. And the more engaged people are, the more bought in they are, and the more they support the change, the faster it's going to happen. So really, at the end of the day, it comes down to speed, and the faster you can deliver your transformation, the faster you're going to reap the benefits of it. So it's also just smart business to drive it with your organization and not do this top down against them type of approach, because it's going to create a lot of this resistance and fatigue that maybe didn't even exist there in the first place, right?
Right.
But in
Hmm.
general, people hate being told what to do. So you
Right.
going out and telling them what to do and that you have to do that or you're going to get fired, that's not an inspirational message that people want to get behind. So it's just going to slow you down. So it's just not a wise way of going about it.
I absolutely agree. This idea of when you're in the world of work, you're with a bunch of adults. And so, and yet then all of a sudden we have this artificial structure that gets superimposed where we are now telling people what to do in this detached sort of way, right? The people who are sitting in the offices telling people back to the grocery store, what is the best way to get through the line or to greet customers or whatever it might be. But they are not in that store, or they haven't been in the store for years, and this has changed and that has changed and the customer base has changed. And and when we engage the individual, as you said, they're more likely, especially if it is an idea that generated with them, right? They're more excited to execute it. And so then the customer service is going to be better and the change is going to be more fruitful, and the possibility of it actually being executed. Because, as you know all too well, you have the top who can put through this change and then it doesn't happen, or it backfires, or it's just so much wasted time and energy and heartache for the people who, in a way, are being experimented on, right? The workers are being experimented on, and it's like, oh, this is just another program to get through. It'll go away in 6 months and we can go back to normal until the next thing comes along. And it really has this us versus them instead of, as you said, the citizen, or I like to think about the community, right? We're in this
Mm,
community together. And what I see a lot on my social media feeds are people feeling so disenchanted by work, job hopping, and their loyalty. It's like I have to either be loyal to the company as if it's my family or loyal to myself, instead of how do I be a professional and be a member of this particular community, a member in good standing? What does that look like? And who am I as a professional, whether or not I'm here for 15 years or 5 years or whatever it might be?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think there are so many bad eggs on both sides, right? There are so many
Mhm.
terrible employers, as we know, but then also this whole quiet quitting and people wanting to do as little as possible and just like leaning back. Like that's also not a solution.
Right.
And yeah, it's much more around how can we get people together and do things together and drive change together rather than just being against each other and both parts get trying to get as much as possible out of the other part while doing as little as possible. I think that's not a productive outlook on life.
Yeah, I think it also your approach is very I'm very interested in human nature. I taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I think that businesses and business theory goes awry when it gets humans wrong. And people in general want to obviously be seen, this sense of belonging. They want to contribute, they want to make a difference. And no matter what your business is, there are ways in which you can contribute and be seen and be a part of the community, which when people are quiet quitting, it's just a signal something is wrong in the organization. Who's not paying attention? What are the systems that are encouraging this kind of behavior? Because people will rise or fall typically to the expectations in front of them. So, what is going on? I think quiet quitting is a signal, gossip is a signal. There are all these signals that we can see that something is wrong structurally or with particular people within the organization that are not getting what we want, which is a successful business.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So opening this business and tell us about that. You wanted to be an entrepreneur. How have you found um, working for yourself, starting an organization and running it?
I love it. I love it. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And I'm very driven by being limitless and having my independence and my freedom. And of course, there are many parts of running a business where, especially together with investors, where you don't have that full freedom in some senses. But it's very much giving me that feeling of my independence and being limitless. So I love it. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And I'm someone that would work really hard, have a lot of discipline, and put a lot of effort into something without like I don't need people telling me what to do or driving me in that sense. So I think that's the a big driver motivator for me is just like the freedom, the independence, being limitless. So I absolutely love it, and I usually tell the team like I love the team that I work with. And one of the greatest benefits of being a founder is being able to select every single person that you get to spend your days with. And that's something I think sometimes people don't think about, that you can actually completely shape your own team, bring on board people that you just love working together with and have so much fun with, and doing this together with them. That's what gives me the biggest. That's my biggest source of energy and inspiration is always the team Tigerhall, which I love. So that's another big benefit.
Most of us have had that experience of working with wonderful colleagues and that synergy and that energy that comes along from being with the team that you resonate with and you're on the same page in what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And yet that is not the reality for many people, right? What I do for a living is I deal with conflict in organizations. Do you have any advice for people who find themselves in a team that just they don't, there's not much joy. They don't seem to really enjoy each other. And they're just there getting the work done. But it's that feeling on Sunday before you go to work that, oh, I've got to go into work. And it's just so awful. Do you have any advice for turning that around?
But I do think a lot of it comes down to the hiring manager, unfortunately, which is not great advice because it's something many people can't affect. Also,
Right.
like when I recruit, for example, I see 50% of recruitment decision is around like, well, these people actually enjoy working together,
Hmm.
and I think that is what drives a lot of retention. Do people
Hmm.
feel like they belong at work? Do they have friends at work? Do
Hmm.
they have fun at work? So ensuring that, I mean, once you've found good and skilled people who have the capabilities to deliver what you require them to deliver, are they also then enjoying each other? So because they're going to have spend more time with each other than they're going to spend with me, for example.
Hmm.
So I do think a lot of it comes down to recruitment. If you're in a situation where like everything is as you just described, something I would probably do before calling it quits is to find curiosity above judgment. That's one of my mantras in general is how can we be more curious and trying to understand other people? Because I think in like there's always something you can learn from everyone. And I always ensure to have conversations with people around me, whether it's an Uber driver or the cashier or like whoever I meet in different scenarios, because I think that helps you get a better picture of human psychology and the world around you and how people work and operate, and that will help you in everything you do. Understanding the world will help you in all kind of business endeavors. So finding curiosity above judgment, I think, is one thing that I would do. And also just being transparent and frank, and perhaps sitting down with them and going like, hey, like, this is what I'm experiencing, are you experiencing the same thing? Usually bringing things to the surface and bringing it up with people will allow those healthy debates. I think the worst thing is when everyone knows it but no one is saying it,
Yeah.
and you have that elephant in the room, right? So I would have a frank and healthy discussion, and whenever we have disagreements on my team, and that happens all the time as well, right? It's about how do we talk to each other and just like get on a call, talk with each other, hash it out, and be frank. And we always learn something from that. And if we have that combination of being frank and authentic and bringing things up and being raw and transparent and honest about things, in combination with that curiosity, I'm here to learn, can you help me understand,
Mhm.
those two in combination has been a winning approach in my experience.
Absolutely. And if you start with a team in which you have relative trust with one another, and you enjoy working with them, and there's a problem, and there will be problems, right? Conflict is not the issue, it's when we don't manage it. It's much easier if you already trust a colleague to have a difficult conversation with them, because you see that it's going to get in the way of the mission, what you're trying to accomplish. If it's something that, sometimes somebody will do something and we say, well, maybe I don't like it, but that's just me and it's something I can get over. But if it is something that is festering and it's making you difficult to work with that person, right, being able and having the expectation with the organization that we do difficult things and we can have these kinds of conversations. And it doesn't mean that I don't like you or I'm trying to get rid of you, but I'm actually, because I respect you, I want to work through this together. And so is you know, some people by nature are kind of conflict averse, right? And they will just run from conflict because of the fear they have of maybe destroying a relationship. And certainly you have had other colleagues who might come from that sort of disposition. Um, what about you? When you think about your life with conflict, has it been something that has been relatively easy for you to approach with people, or is it something that you've had to work at?
So I'm the opposite of conflict averse. I'm rather like run into conflict. I usually joke with my brother because my brother is the most conflict averse person I know, and like he would not bring up anything with anyone. And I'm like the opposite. I was always the one when we were children to like take all the fights with our parents and relatives and everything else. Because I'm very much a person that's like I do what I say and I mean what I say and I say what I mean. That type of
Mhm.
approach. So and for me, it's important that people know where I stand and where they have me. And if I like something, I will tell them. If I don't like something, I will tell them. So people never have to guess. And that's the same way I approach conflict. I just bring it up, but again, with that curiosity, right?
Mhm.
And what is very important, and you know this much better than I do with your studies and experience in the space, but the language you use is so critical. And this goes down to relationship as well, right? If like marriage and all sorts of relationships we have, is what language are you using?
Mhm.
And I think in the workplace, similar to any relationship, it's when you do X, it makes me feel Y. And not telling people you are ABC or you are this, you are that, like not putting labels on people, because
Mhm.
that is what usually generates frustration and conflict, but saying, hey, like, and also assuming good intentions, right? Like that's another thing that I do. I actually think everyone has good intentions. I
Mhm.
don't think anyone is out there to destroy things for anyone, right? So the way to approach it then would be, when you do X, it affects Y in this way type of language. And then having those assuming good intentions and curiosity. So that might be, let's say, you have brought a like there's a conflict in the team between you and one of the team members, right? And then I might approach you by saying, hey, I noticed A, B, and C, and like when you do this in this environment, it might lead to this person feeling in this way because of this and that rationale. And what are your thoughts on it? Like always end with a question, right? Like asking them for, because they might have reflected on this as much or even more as you have. And that's something that people underestimate as well, is that they think they are the only ones thinking of it. No, like
Right.
other people might also have thought about it. So when you open with an invitation to reflect,
Mhm.
I find it has much better impact, and you can start that conflict resolution, right? And just asking people, this is what I've observed, which leads to this type of experience for these people. What are your reflections on it? Or is this something you've experienced as well? And then you hear where they stand. And if they go, oh, like I've never thought of that, like I don't agree, da 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 da, then you know where you can start the conversation, compared with if someone starts with, yeah, like I'm so glad you brought that up. I've really been thinking about this. How can we do this? And then coming back to again drive change with your organization, not against it. How can you co-create a solution
Mhm.
and make them part of it, and asking how do you think we can do this better? If the goal is ABC,
Yeah.
how can we arrive at a solution? So I think a lot of the like kind of coaching language and asking
Mhm.
questions and approaching it from a lens of curiosity, not judgment. And the worst thing you can do is walking in there and say like, hey, Mary, this is what you're doing, and you are X and you are that, and you need to change this. Like talking at people
Yeah.
is just going to create that resistance, right? So, but usually, yeah, people have good intentions, and being curious about like, oh, like, I know that you're trying to achieve X, but it comes out in this way. What are your thoughts on it? I think that's how most conflict gets resolved.
Well, I 100% agree. I mean, this curiosity, asking questions, assuming positive intent instead of the other, right? When somebody is causing us pain, if we don't notice it and decide to address it, it can compound. And so now we have told a story about this person, typically unflattering about them, and how they're irrational and irrational. And once we start spinning that kind of narrative, then we're unlikely to have those conversations because we've already decided that they are, instead of looking at the particular behavior. And so if you're looking and you notice, then it is much easier to, in a de-escalated kind of way, once you've figured out specifically what it is that is going on, open that dialogue, have these sorts of questions, and see what they see and what they're thinking, and move forward. So, as somebody who is not conflict averse, you are around people, I'm sure you have been around people in work environments who won't deal with their conflict. And that is the thing with conflict, is that it's not only the two or more parties that are involved, it affects people on the team, it affects the organization. What have you seen, or have you seen as being maybe a bystander to somebody else's conflict, either in the role you have now or in earlier roles? And did you do anything about it?
I think as a bystander, it depends what type of like what your role is as a bystander. Like, are you the manager of these people? Are you
Mhm.
their leader? That's different if you're a colleague. If you're a distant colleague and you see it from afar, like in general, I would say like it's up to those people to resolve it. Like you don't need to solve every single political issue in your organization. You don't need to
Okay.
take it on yourself. And that can easily get very stressful if you're going to worry about everyone else, right?
Right.
But if you're the manager or leader, then I would, and this is still my approach today, like I always encourage them to speak with each other first. And I would then give, similar to the advice I just gave around listening, assuming good intent, asking for what they think, and co-creating. So I would give that type of advice to both of them, and then encourage them to have a one-to-one. So not getting involved as a mediating manager at first, I
Mhm.
think is key. Then if it goes to a level where it's just like it's starting to affect the rest of the business, or it goes uncontrolled, then you might have to take a little bit more of an active approach. But generally, first, if I'm the bystander, as a leader, I would encourage them to speak one-to-one first. And also just like hearing them out, like, and going in with that, like listening, trying to understand, like help me understand what's happening here type of approach. So I think it depends on, yeah, like what kind of bystander you are. And especially if you're in a leadership role, you need to take it a little bit different compared to if you're just seeing two colleagues quarreling over in the corner. You might not have to be the one stopping them all the time.
Yes, I think it's so important when you are the leader to obviously empower people to be able to solve their own problems. So that's, not stepping in and assuming that they can't, but giving them ample space and any sort of coaching that is needed for them to do it. And Yet we have these real problems at work, and sometimes they can't be solved with one another. And people really do want help, and sometimes they don't know how to ask. And other colleagues don't want to be in a hostile environment where all of a sudden, are these people going to go at it at a meeting? Or it can be very disruptive when it is allowed to go on too long and nobody is stepping up, and people can feel very disenfranchised. And it's amazing how that conflict unmanaged can just really tank a team or an organization.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And at that point, I think people shouldn't be afraid to escalate it.
Mhm,
Like if it starts affecting the business and impacting relationships in that severe sense, like escalate all the way to the CEO. Like
mhm.
the CEO should know that these are the kind of issues we're having in the organization, and knowing that this is what is stopping us from moving forward or hindering productivity or progress or whatever it might be, like escalate it. And if the CEO is doing nothing about it, then that also tells you about what kind of organization she or he is running, right? But I think like escalating it before it gets too far.
Mhm.
And then there should be leaders that are making decisions. And if it's largely one person, then there should be actions taken around that person, right? So people have to be willing to make decisions to resolve it too.
Absolutely. So, working with big organizations and their communication challenges, when I think about a large organization, I know a lot of times everyday colleagues and workers they can get lost, right? So, they maybe aren't the decision makers or they're at the middle management level. And this feeling, this depersonalization that can happen within a large organization where you become a number and you have these detached policies that may not always match up the reality of my experience or what's going on in the particular year we live in. How do you help organizations to really, so to have these organizational structures so large organizations can run with excellent communication, but see the individual so that the individual feels like they are a part of and being heard and being able to contribute.
Yeah, that's where the two-way feedback loops are so key, and being able to actually capture that intel from the ground to see how are people feeling, what are they saying, what are their questions, what is their input, and giving them a voice. There are way too many organizations that are just not giving employees a voice. And when you look at how you map people in a change process, right? And you want to see, are they champions or soldiers, saboteurs, or rebels? There are four different categories of their level of support. And the biggest thing impacting if they're going to take an active role in shaping it is if they feel like they're heard,
Mhm.
if they feel like they have a voice, if people are asking them for their input. So the feedback loops are incredibly key. And then to your point on how do we see the individual, there is so much that you can do around personalization in communications that is actually very simple, and I wouldn't say easy, but it's simple and straightforward to do, that would help you overcome a lot of those. Because there is nothing worse than, for example, if you're receiving something that isn't in your local language, like everything is English from headquarters and you're in Japan and you're like, I mean, there's nothing less inclusive than being spoken to in a language that isn't yours. So there are very simple things you can do around geography and language, for example. Also, when it comes to tenure with the organization, if someone has been there for 20 years, it feels pretty patronizing to be told the same thing as someone that joined last week. Like that doesn't help making them feel special. And then of course you have data around seniority, people's functions, like all of those, what I call like static data that doesn't change every day, that can actually be used to see the individual up to 40-50%, right? So you get quite far with personalizing based on that data, and just ensuring that the way you communicate with a CFO in Japan is different to how you communicate with a newly hired SDR in Canada, for example. So that's where organizations can do so much, yet very few actually do it many times. And then beyond that, if you want to go from the 50 to 100%, you have things like the metadata around a specific change. So like when is it happening? Like what stage is it in? At what time does it hit a certain employee? Are you in the beginning of it? Is it a certain workflow that has just started? Like all of those time and activity based data points where you can also use to, which you can also use to see the employee. And then the last part is that the feedback data, right? If someone is very engaged, very on it, very excited about a change initiative, you might want to talk to them slightly different and see them in a different way compared to someone who's more on the fence or maybe not bought in yet or more neutral. So that kind of targeting and personalization is also very key. And most of all, it's making people feel like, okay, you are talking to me and you actually care if like what if my tenure is longer or more senior, or like I'm based in this region, like you actually see that, and my voice is heard, so I can also speak back to you. Because
Hmm.
there is nothing more patronizing than, okay, like you don't care who I am and you're just telling me things. And we know this from one-to-one conversations as well, right? If we meet someone
Right.
in a bar and they just keep talking at us and telling us all about them and doesn't care at all about us, we're going to leave that bar pretty quickly, right?
Yeah.
So it goes the same in large scale corporate communications, and that's where I think organizations can do a much better job with relatively simple tools and ways to solve for that.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many systems out there. Of course, with the development of AI, it's just going to get better. But also, of course, it's the focus. Like, am I taking care of my people? Am I, you know, how do I think about, I don't really like thinking about necessarily employees as customers. I do like the community. I love that word citizen. I'm gonna have to think more about that. But that's a different way of thinking about the level of care. But there is a level of care instead of cogs in the machine, right? And so when it comes to communication and it comes to change, I'm writing a book right now on generation gaps and work and the sort of artificial war between, if you are 60 versus 20 versus 30, the whole work ethic. How do you see, or what kind of challenges do you see around the different generations that we have at work? Because you mentioned seniority, and sometimes when somebody's been in an organization for a long time, there's a kind of derision, like they're out of touch, they've been here too long, we need the new. And sometimes it's
Mm,
not that way at all. It's the reverse. The new, we don't have you have nothing to say to us because you're new, and so we're not going to listen to you. You have to have been here for X amount of time for you to have a voice in this organization.
yeah. Yeah, and that's problematic, right? And then sometimes it's both at the same time. You don't listen to the the old ones or the young ones. You think that no one has good ideas, and that's even more problematic. But I think it's important to recognize, but also to still see people beyond their age or those characteristics, right? So while you can use them to personalize more, it should also not be assumed that just because someone is older, they wouldn't be okay with this kind of communication style, or just because they're younger, they don't have experience and any input. So I think that's where that's where it becomes more dangerous, right? At a personalization level, if you start generalizing and assuming on behalf of others, the best you can really do is to give people options. So, for example, in the work that we do at Tigerhall, right, like you have on the platform the way people communicate, you have podcast, you have video, you have live stream, you have Parry. Like there's so many different formats and languages, so people can choose: do I want to listen to this in French or do I want to read it in Thai? And giving that choice to the individual to let them choose how they want to consume the content and the information and how they want to participate. That's key. And then thinking of like what you mentioned, the seniors and the more new joiners, right? Like making sure that both of them have their voices heard. And you will always find people in those like generalized buckets, but there are also, in my experience, so many people that are not in those buckets, right? Like people usually ask me, for example, oh, I can't imagine anyone over 50 who enjoys a short video. I'm like, that's actually the number one thing they prefer is a short video. Like my parents spend more time on social media than I do. Like
Right.
that's actually completely wrong. And then many people say that, oh, like Gen Z and they're this and that, and they maybe like they all they want is like short form videos, right? But actually Gen Z really appreciate in person. Like a
Mhm.
lot of them really enjoy being together with people in person, and they would be less on the digital tools than some of the older generations. So I think all sorts of generalizations are just unhelpful most of the time. Um, it's good to think of them from a messaging perspective, especially when it comes to like, yeah, the tenure, the geography, and like making sure that you're thinking of those things as you communicate, but then at the same time, not assuming based on those things, and allowing the two-way feedback loops is what makes the biggest difference, because that's when you can have a pulse. And it might turn out that someone in those two different generations are actually more similar than you initially thought.
I absolutely agree. The so-called generation wars we talk about, I think it's artificial and it's not true. And there is also something to the place that you were raised, the technology that was available, the going ideology that forms us as we enter into work. But I was just talking to my son, he's 17, and we have an Instagram account for our cat. And I started during COVID because I was bored and I was taking pictures of my cat. And so he said to me yesterday, Mom, I'll take over the Instagram account for our cat Ronan. And I said, Great, but what are the rules? And it's like, I don't want them taking pictures of the messy, like the cat next to socks on the ground or whatever it is. And I said, well, you could just edit those parts out. And he said, I don't know how to edit a video. And I'm like, I have been editing videos forever. And I mean, he's 17. And I thought, we just make these assumptions that if you're a particular
Mm,
age, you have a certain comfort level with technology or whatever it might be. Or if you're a certain age, you don't know what a PDF is or what to do about it when you get one, right? These sort of tired tropes that get bantered around that make it so that we look at the other with suspicion. You want to understand me because you have different values or you have different ways in which you are unwilling to interact with the modern world. And it seems to me, because a lot of the work, obviously the work that I do is about conflict, and conflict, not always, but largely is due to some kind of miscommunication, where we're not curious and we're not asking these open-ended questions and we're not having regular conversations and we're doing a lot of assuming. And people are not empowered in their organizations to deal with their conflicts early, often, swiftly, and justly, so that they can be empowered to then move forward. And and so I am really interested in what you're trying to accomplish with change, which is inevitable and good, and it's going to happen whether we like it or not, but in such a way that once the change is put in place, it's not outdated, right? And that it's actually something that's going to help the organization to move forward. Like th that kind of communication, dealing with the fact that there's so many different modes of communication that sometimes the message ends up getting lost because of the modes themselves, the all the different ways in which we're supposed to interact, and we can get lost in that.
yeah, yeah, there's definitely too much noise and too many different things for employees to piece things together from, right? Because if you think of a change initiative being rolled out and how fragmented that experience is for the employee, like
Mhm.
I see many times change and transformation leaders think that, oh, like we're touching all of these different channels and it's everywhere, so people won't miss it. But actually, it many times makes the opposite, where the employees then find like, oh, like what am I supposed to consume in which order, and like maybe I missed the town hall, and like is that then covered on the SharePoint site, and when should I start this training? And it's just like they get told things from left, right, and center, right? And it's hard for them to piece together in like which order should I do this. And also then for the change management to have somewhat of a control of the story, right? Because if people miss, I mean, half of it is good if they only miss half of it. Most people miss 80-85% of it. So what pieces are they then seeing? And that will shape their perception of the story around the change. And you
Mhm.
want to avoid that happening. You want to make sure that people have a similar perception and story in their minds about why we're doing this change, what is the change, and how do I contribute to this change. And ideally in that order, right? You don't want people to the first thing they see is this is how you're going to change your work process. Now click here and use the system instead. Like if you start with that, people are just going to be like, yeah, like as you said earlier, like until next quarter, and it's going to become this flavor of the month kind of approach, and people
Right.
are just going to wait it out. So you want to have that control, and you also want to make it easier for employees to consume what is being sent to them, and having that two-way feedback loop instantly while they are consuming it, right? So as opposed to having SharePoint site number 50,000 that people are not going to find, and then emails where internal email open rates is between 7 to 9% for most organizations.
Mhm.
And then you have a distant LMS platform that people visit once a year for their compliance training, and some intranet, which is very static that people mostly don't go to. And having it across all of these different platforms, and then the town hall and the team message and so on, it's going to be difficult for people to make sense of it. So to help people make sense of it is about that sequencing. How can you put it
Mhm.
in a journey? How can you have it delivered by people that are close to them, that they actually look up to, trust, and respect? So not having it sent from like Project Synergy and headquarters, because no one relates to Project Synergy, but people relate to people.
Right.
And then designing it in formats that are easy to consume, easy to understand, and that breaks through that noise, right? Because if you're doing specific change communications, being part of the BAU in the sense of like sending yet another email when their inboxes are already overflowing with emails, that's not going to make it stand out. It's not going to make people see that, oh, this is something different here
Mhm.
that I should pay attention to. So like breaking through the noise there is very critical, but mostly order. And if you don't have order and organization, then how can you expect employees to understand it logically and sequentially when you're all over the place?
It's just really a beautiful way of thinking about treating people well at work because it's not, I think that an old method is, sort of the command and control, just do it. This is what we're doing, execute. And yet, if we want feedback from people, we want people to actually do it, then people want to know what's going on, right? And so I think sometimes people think, oh, I don't want to burden. No, 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 no. People want to know, why are we doing this? For everything that you said, what is the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? This is what we're doing. These are the steps. This is where we are in the step. This is how you work. And that feedback loop, as you keep on saying, I think that's so very important. And I think it's a really beautiful picture of how do we really treat people as people? How do we really show that we are thinking about you, right? We're not just thinking about the product or the change. We're thinking about how you are a part of the change in the organization, about how you are going to implement this and what it will be like for you. And you're a human person, and as adults, we want to know what's going on, the why behind it, and all these other sorts of things. And so many people will comply, even if they don't maybe like or agree with the why, but they know what the why is, right? And they've been told along, and not just told, but encouraged to be a part of. Then you're just going to get such a better possibility of the change being implemented and at a high level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all about making sure people feel heard and feel like they are part of it, not that it happens to them, but that it
Yeah.
happens through them.
Through them and with them. I love that. So Nellie, as you look into the future of the world of work, this is sort of the question I'd like to end on. What do you think needs to happen so that not only are people treated with dignity and respect at work, because that's just sort of a baseline, but we want more than that. We want to thrive and flourish. So what do you think needs to happen for that to occur?
I think we need to, I mean, there are a couple of things and there are no silver bullets, but I think building in this mindset of curiosity that we spoke about, I think that's incredibly key. And I don't think that the world we currently live in from like a social media kind of perspective helps with that, where everything is about forming an opinion as quickly as you can and taking a stance, which is very black and white. And the world is actually gray, but I feel like we've lost that grayscale and everything is turned black and white and binary and you have to have an opinion or else type of thing. And I think
Mhm.
we're seeing that sipping into the world of work as well, where it then becomes like taking sides, taking teams. And I do think we need to have a greater appreciation for the complexity and the nuances that it actually takes to both in organizations and the world of work and just like the world in general, and how the world works is much more nuanced and complex than most people have, I would say, respect for. And I do think much of this comes down to education, like how we raise our children, but also how we approach society as people, right? And if we approach society as this black and white and it's right or wrong and it's only two sides of the coin, I think that's going to be harmful to the workplace as well, because that's when you're going to get these employer employee, you're going to get the right and wrong, you're going to get everything being binary, and it's very very far from being binary in most cases. And if you look at change and transformation, for example, like, is the change good or bad? like there's no such thing as a good change or a bad change. Like it's going to be good for some people, bad for others. It's going to be good to drive certain things and maybe less good for other things and so on. So having that nuance and complexity, I think, is the key. And I think the key to understanding or getting to that point of nuance and complexity is approaching it with a lens of curiosity rather than judgment, and asking questions and being open-minded, having assuming good intent that we spoke about, and also just having a little bit more, I don't know, like, what do you call it, intellectual flexibility in some ways, like understanding that there is, like, two truths can be true at the same time, if I put
Mhm.
it that way. Like it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be one or the other. You can like hold two thoughts in your mind that could be contradictory but also still be true. I think that will help us both deal with people better, resolve conflict better, build better relationships, and just overall create better environments when we can be less black and white and live more in the gray.
I really like that. And I think it's interesting in the sense that, we talk more and more about diversity, embracing diversity, and yet that seems to be being bleached out of culture and in organizations where we want this more compliance. It is this binary. It's you're with us, you're against us, you have this position or that position. And it doesn't allow for the messiness of human experience. It doesn't allow for the multifacetedness of who we are and creativity, right? If we really want to be creative, then we ought to embrace difference and we ought to embrace nuance, and so that we can co-create and we can really collaborate. Collaboration is not everybody getting into the same, getting be in one line and everyone's just shaking their head. And yet when we have these the council culture or whatever it might be, where difference is seen as suspect. And yes, our culture does not model sustaining ideas. And it's more, if you speak, it's got to be completed. Instead of real curiosity means that I'm willing to go someplace with you, and my ideas may not be completely formed, but I'm willing to be open to getting it wrong. I'm open to being misunderstood. I'm open to not having all of the answers. And then I really do want input from others because I don't have all the answers. And a real belief, a real belief that we are better together and that I'm not the only one who is fantastic. I am fantastic, but other people are too, and they see things that I don't see. And I just think it's so strange that we've been talking a lot about diversity and belonging, and yet, in a way, we are trying to squeeze that out into this sort of monochromatic, you're blue or you're red, in the States, right? Or whatever it might be. Yeah,
Yeah, so true.
absolutely. Well, Nellie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Tigerhall.
Thank you for
Yes.
having me.
Thank you. Well, take care.
You too.
Thank you, Nellie, for being on Conflict Managed. I really enjoyed our conversation together and the really interesting work that you are doing in change management. Change is the name of the game, and this communication that you're working on so that we can actually communicate in an effective way where people are seen. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Conflict Managed is produced by Third Party Workplace Conflict Restoration Services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. You can find us online at 3pconflictrestoration.com. Come back, we have new episodes every Tuesday, and you can watch this conversation with Nellie and I on YouTube. It's at 3P Conflict Restoration. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And if you haven't had a chance to check out my book, it's called How to Be Unprofessional at Work, Tips to Ensure Failure. It's 80 tips of what not to do and starts a conversation about what to do instead. Well, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Take care. Till next time.